Hi, Art 101ers. So let's try this again. We're going to talk today about abstract expressionism, a movement in the arts in the United States, primarily in the middle of the 20th century. And of course, we're going to have a quiz on this information in a couple of weeks. And so I want to give you a couple of hints about taking notes. First of all, when you see a slide like this, and don't worry about this now. We're going to talk about this stuff later. I'm just giving you this as an example here. But don't worry about frantically writing down everything that you see on this slide, because I'm going to create a PDF package of these slides for you as a study guide. Okay, so you'll have this written down, right? What I want you to concentrate on instead is being ready to answer questions about these ideas, right? Understanding the shift from figurative or representational art to abstraction, right? So when you hear information or have ideas about those things, that's what I want you to jot down in your notes, right? Why did art become sort of figurative and representational? Why did it move toward abstraction? Okay, see the relationship between current events, especially World War II, in art practice in the United States. Okay, so ideas about that I talk about and that you see in the work is what you want to write down, because those are the things the questions will be about. Understanding the transformation of artwork from picture, in quotes, to thing. Again, an important concept. And then the last one's kind of a summary of all of it. What you want to do is you want to be ready to explain why art starts to look like this. And that's what we'll start talking about now. We'll go ahead and do that. We're going to jump back 50 years or so to some prominent American artists in the late 19th century, back when art looked like that, right? And this might be something a little more typical that you would expect in a class like this. One of my favorite painters of the year, John Singer Sargent, who was a masterful portrait painter and had a long career of painting portraits of mostly aristocratic women whose husbands would commission them to make portraits. Incidentally, this image I took with my cell phone. This is at the Honolulu Museum of Art. So if we get an opportunity to go over to Honolulu anytime, stop by the Art Museum. They actually have a couple of really nice examples of some of the painters we'll talk about, even a few that we'll talk about today. Sargent also did at the end of his career in life, he did a large commission for the Imperial War Museum in Great Britain, and they wanted to commission an artwork to commemorate and memorialize the end of World War I, much like our Marine Corps memorial that we saw in a former class. And so they commissioned Sargent, and he went out into the field and watched these these soldiers at the time who were gassed in a gas attack during World War I. And he thought that was the sort of perfect image to sort of commemorate this horrible historical experience. Here's another prominent artist, and I should mention actually that while John Singer Sargent and this artist are American artists, and this is James Whistler's work, they spent most of their careers in Europe. Okay, they were expatriates, and the reason is because there really wasn't an art market in the United States, right? There weren't enough people who bought commissioned paintings and stuff. That was all happening still in Europe, and in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And so, to make livings as that kind of artist, they really had to go there and participate in the European art market. And again, this is James Whistler's work. It's a very famous American painting, and I'm curious if any of you have seen it before, because it's something that was a very iconic painting when I grew up as a kid, but I recognize now that a lot of people aren't as familiar with it. It goes by a very famous name. It's a painting called Whistler's Mother. And I say it's called Whistler's Mother because that's not the official title of it. It is indeed a portrait of the artist James Whistler, his mother. But the actual title is Arrangement in Gray and Black Number 1, painted as you see here in 1871. And it's important to understand that because Whistler's ideas were less about the representation of figures and stuff and more about these, and I'll use the term abstract since we're talking about that now, but more about these conceptual ideas about paint and color. And so rather than painting a portrait of a person, he sees an opportunity to just play around with these two colors he's interested in, gray and black. And so he uses that in fact, the story about Whistler's mother was he had hired a model to come over and paint, and the model didn't show up. And so his mother agreed to sit since he was planning on painting all day. And that's the only reason he even bothered to paint a portrait of his mother, right? So the portrait, the subject matter didn't matter. to Whistler in that way. He was far more interested in the formal aspects of painting, right? So it could be a model I hire, it could be my mom, doesn't matter. Sit down, I'm going to make this painting because I want to make a painting about the arrangement in gray and black. So we see even in the late 19th century, these ideas about that change art are starting to formulate. There's a nice Whistler, as a matter of fact, in the Honolulu Museum as well. So if you get an opportunity, go ahead and check that out. Another famous American artist, and he's an artist who stayed in the United States, Thomas Eakins, painted, and I'm going to show one picture of his. He's actually more famous, you might be interested to note, because he was one of the first American art school teachers. He founded the United States sort of first college of art at, I believe it was Tufts University in Philadelphia, but it was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And he created the model for teaching art, including drawing from the figure and classes like two-dimensional design and things like that. That's still primarily practiced today in studio art programs, even here at Hawaii Community College and UH. And so he's an important historical figure in the American arts, less so as a painter, but more so as an educator. Another prominent American artist right around the turn of the century is Frederick Remington, who painted primarily Western scenes. He was also a sculptor who did sculptures that were very similar in subject matter this way. He's interesting because his style of work becomes a very prominent commercial style in the United States in the 20th century. And in fact, I became first acquainted with his paintings when I was a kid because I used to love to read Western novels. And it was not too often, it was often that they would use his paintings on these little, pocket novels that I would read as a kid. It's also interesting to note that, let's go back actually real quick. So I want to say one more thing about Remington. There's a great deal of his artwork in the collection of the United States government, and you can often, almost anytime you see art in the White House, you'll see a Remington statue or perhaps a painting, because it's a very popular art style to be presented by, and the presidents themselves get to pick what paintings are in the White House. I even saw recently, maybe a year or so back, that when the current president was doing something in the room, and sure enough, there it was. There was a Remington bronze sculpture on the mantle behind him. So it's they're almost always there. I was talking about the commercial practice and how that kind of illustrative style leaked into American commercial art. And that brings us to N.C. Wyeth, who's another great painter of the era, and one that's very predictive of what we're going to talk about today. You can see at the end of this statement, he says that as you can tell by this statement, he unfortunately was such a successful commercial painter that he didn't get to do a lot of his own work, and he always regretted that. He wanted to be a great artist like John Singer Sargent and that, but instead he became most famous for illustrations on these novels that you see. And he says that he bitched himself the accursed success in skin-deep pictures and illustrations. And he says that an illustration must be made practical, not only in its dramatic statement, but must be a thing that will adapt itself to the engravers and printers' limitations, right, to the commercial ways that they're going to be printed. He says this fact alone kills that underlying inspiration to create thought. Now think about that, right? He's actually less interested, it seems to be, in making pictures than it is to express thought, and that's going to be an informative idea moving into the 20th century. Here's an example of his work from one of those books, right? Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island was printed up as back in those days they would do hardbound books, and like each chapter would start with an illustration like this, and so he made images very much like this. And as I said, they became very influential, and they started an entire industry in the United States of commercial art practice specifically for these paperbacks. I thought this was kind of a funny one since it's about an artist in a studio. And prominent Gordon Johnson was one of the guys who made hundreds and hundreds of these paintings for romance novels and all sorts of things that happen that way. And of course, it leaked into other products as well, and it definitely had an influence on me as a young artist. Here's another Gordon Johnson, again, another Western novel, kind of romance, historical drama for an inexpensive paperback novel. That's what we used to do before the internet. We used to read little books. But for me, as you can see here, this style of illustration was also used in toys and things that kids. This is a model of Dracula, so as a youngster, I would go into a store and I'd be mesmerized by these images, and drawn to wanting to sort of play with that toy or make that sort of thing. And later on, it got me into these. Jack Lanewood was a prominent aviation illustrator who painted all these pictures for the model airplane boxes that I would, again, stand mesmerized by, for this sort of super colorful action excitement that they drew me as a kid to these products. And again, that's, sort of an interesting thing to think about, right? We're using it to be drawn to products. I'd be remiss to not talk a little bit about Thomas Hart Benton, who was another sort of prominent American artist, and he was one of the few artists that at that time created a name for himself as a figurative painter. As art was moving more and more toward abstraction, Benton steadfastly chose to be a figurative painter. And he says that part of it was from the work he did for the government during World War I, painting patterns of ships. And as you can see, after the war, he declares himself the enemy of modernism, right? The enemy of these movements towards abstraction and figuration, away from figuration that we're talking about. And so he began a naturalistic and representational work, today known as regionalism. So there was a counter movement going on in the United States of regionalism. And Benton is really one of the best sort of examples of what that looks like. Here's, and he was primarily a muralist, by the way. This is a panel from a mural that will appear, that appeared, if I remember, in a school. Let's go ahead and see what the New School for Social Research did this panel. You can see this is the kind of image that Benton was famous for, right? These kind of Americana pictures. Here we see the nightclubbers juxtaposed with this preacher, right? So he's painting these sort of little slices of American life, and that's what regionalism was about, right? It was about, while art became more sort of abstract and weird, right? There was this group of painters who wanted to make referential work that was about the world around them, that people could relate to, and that's as much as you can say sort of about Thomas Hart Benton in that way. To this day, there are dozens of murals all across the Midwest, primarily in state buildings and things like that. As you can see, this one was made for a department store, and it was later moved to the Smithsonian. And that way, here's one at the Missouri State House that's still there today. And so you can see actually how magnificent they were when you see them actually in the context of the room that they're made for, right? And again, another sort of classic idea here in a state building. This shows the history of Missouri with good, hardworking guys, with the plows and the trains and all. So it's a very sort of relatable kind of work. As artwork seemed to get less and less relatable to the normal person, regionalism caught hold in the United States because it maintained that connection. This is the Truman Library, the Presidential Library for Harry S. Truman in Independence, Missouri, which is near Kansas City. I know a lot about Benton because I went to the Kansas City Art Institute for my undergraduate degree, and he was an instructor there for many years, and of course one of the most famous artists from the Kansas City area. So we saw and learned a lot about him. Interestingly, a little bit of controversy behind him as well, as you can see, for the Indiana State Fair in 1933. I'm sorry, it's not for the State Fair, but for the exhibition in Chicago. He was the Indiana people who were going to have a state exhibition there commissioned him to make this large mural about the history of Indiana. And he didn't pull any punches, because the history of Indiana features the Ku Klux Klan. As you can see, in Indiana, 30% of adult males were estimated to be members of the Klan, and in 1924, KKK members were elected as governor and other political offices. And so he depicts a Klan meeting in this painting, and of course that didn't go over very well. It was moved out of a public building and into Indiana University, where it was sort of considered in an educational institution was more appropriate. But I just learned actually recently now that that's not even the case. They're trying to move it off the university because they think it's a triggering for many people. I also learned, and they didn't teach us this at the Kansas City Art Institute, but he was essentially dismissed from the Art Institute for disparaging remarks against, let's just say it's the art market in that way. And I want to talk about one more artist before we finish up this little demonstration here, discussion here, and that's Andrew Wyeth, who was, as a matter of fact, N.C. Wyeth's son. And Andrew Wyeth was another sort of regionalist artist, who was able to live the dream that his father, unfortunately, was never able to do because he was too busy making commercial illustrations. Wyeth becomes one of the most famous and prominent American painters of the 20th century. Throughout the 20th century, in fact, he was painting in the 1980s and 90s until his death. And one of his most famous, I should say, maybe his favorite, paintings of the time was Christina's World in 1948. And I want to pause here. If we were able to do this synchronously, I would have opened it up for discussion, because I think it's an interesting painting to sort of help us understand what was happening on the other side of the coin, to think about it. And what I was going to ask you, and I want you to kind of do this on your own and kind of think about it as we end this lecture, just about how you would interpret this image, right? What does this image mean, right? Christina's World, right? We see this Midwestern field, looks like Iowa to me, right? And these farmhouses in the distance, and there's this woman sort of sitting in the grass, seemingly sort of reaching out or moving towards these farmhouses. It seemed to be sort of up this intimidating hill, right? And it's the idea that there can be narrative and meaning in a picture like this that becomes the issue, right? So I'm kind of curious what you think, and what does this image mean to you, right? And then think of it in a more broad way, right? How does an image like this gain meaning, right? Think about that. Does it rely on your interpretation of it? Right? Does it mean whatever you decide it's supposed to mean? Does it rely on the artist's intention, right? The artist maybe intended it to mean something or be about something, right? Does it? And that's what I like about this painting, is it seems a sort of very realistic painting, but it has this kind of oddly kind of nightmarish or dreamlike quality to it, an unrealistic quality to it as well, right? And so, that's the question that's posed. And we'll end here on this little video, and we'll start up the next one to see what else is going on in this time that influences these questions.